As we had finished up Chapter 5 of Anne of Green Gables yesterday, you were to copy down the note card letting you know what a summary is. It's a short retelling. It only includes important parts. For stories, it's the important action from the beginning and end. When you're summarizing, it might help to ask yourself who did what in the beginning, who did what in the middle, and who did what at the end. You want to follow through that main action from beginning, middle to end. We had these two summaries of the first 5 chapters of Anne. Specifically in Chapter 5, Marilla was on the way taking Anne back because she and her brother Matthew had intended to adopt an orphan boy. And on the trip, Anne had told Marilla what life had been like for Anne so far. At the end of Chapter 6, we'll do another summary, and you are also going to have to be able to answer some basic questions about what happens in Chapter 6 to make sure that you are understanding this. That will be an assignment over in TeacherMade, so do be sure you are ready for that. Right now, Chapter 6.
All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, May 2007. Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 6. Marilla Makes Up Her Mind. Get there they did, however, in due season. Mrs. Spencer lived in a big yellow house at White Sands Cove, and she came to the door with surprise and welcome mingled on her benevolent face. "Dear, dear," she exclaimed, "you're the last folks I was looking for today, but I'm real glad to see you. You'll put your horse in? And how are you, Anne?" "I'm as well as can be expected, thank you," said Anne smilelessly. A blight seemed to have descended on her. "I suppose we'll stay a little while to rest the mare," said Marilla, "but I promised Matthew I'd be home early. The fact is, Mrs. Spencer, there's been a queer mistake somewhere, and I've come over to see what it is. We sent word, Matthew and I, for you to bring us a boy from the asylum. We told your brother Robert to tell you we wanted a boy 10 or 11 years old." "Marilla Cuthbert, you don't say so," said Mrs. Spencer in distress. "Why, Robert sent down word by his daughter Nancy, and she said you wanted a girl. Didn't she, Flora Jane?" appealing to her daughter, who had come out to the steps. "She certainly did, Miss Cuthbert," corroborated Flora Jane earnestly. "I'm dreadfully sorry," said Mrs. Spencer. "It's too bad, but it certainly wasn't my fault, you see, Miss Cuthbert. I did the best I could, and I thought I was following your instructions. Nancy is a terrible flighty thing. I have often had to scold her well for her heedlessness." "It was our own fault," said Marilla resignedly. "We should have come to you ourselves and not left an important message to be passed along by word of mouth in that fashion."
So now we've finally narrowed down why it is that Matthew and Marilla got a girl instead of a boy. They had the message passed along by word of mouth. So here's how it would have gone. Matthew and Marilla would have told Robert. So Robert is Mrs. Spencer's brother. Matthew and Marilla told their friend Robert, "We want to adopt a boy." So, here is the friend Robert. Robert gets told by Matthew and Marilla from Green Gables, "We want to adopt a boy." Robert then sends his daughter, Nancy, with the message. Robert tells Nancy, Matthew and Marilla want to adopt a boy. So the message goes from Marilla to Robert to Nancy. Nancy finally ends up at Mrs. Spencer's house. Mrs. Spencer would be Nancy's aunt, so Robert's sister. And Nancy tells Mrs. Spencer, "Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert told my dad that they want to adopt a girl." So the more people that are involved in passing on a message, the more likely is that the message is going to be wrong or different at the end than it was at the beginning. Continuing.
"Anyhow, the mistake has been made, and the only thing to do is set it right. Can we send the child back to the asylum? I suppose they'll take her back, won't they?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Spencer thoughtfully, "but I don't think it will be necessary to send her back. Mrs. Peter Blewett was up here yesterday, and she was saying to me how much she wished she'd sent by me for a little girl to help her. Mrs. Peter has a large family, you know, and she finds it hard to get help. Anne will be the very girl for you. I call it positively providential." Marilla did not look as if she thought Providence had much to do with the matter. Here was an unexpectedly good chance to get this unwelcome orphan off her hands, and she did not even feel grateful for it. She knew Mrs. Peter Blewett only by sight, as a small, shrewish-faced woman without an ounce of superfluous flesh on her bones. But she had heard of her. A terrible worker and driver, Mrs. Peter was said to be, and discharged servant girls told fearsome tales of her temper and stinginess, and her...
So we find out that Marilla has a chance to get rid of Anne, to not be responsible for her anymore. That's what she wanted until she finds out who is going to take Anne. What do we know about Mrs. Peter? Not so much awful because she's small, more because if you are a worker and driver, that doesn't mean you yourself are working. That means you expect other people to work for you. She has a bad temper, and she doesn't like to pay well. She likes to hang on to her own money. She has a lot of quarrelsome children.
her family of pert, quarrelsome children. Marilla felt a qualm of conscience at the thought of handing Anne over to her tender mercies. "Well, I'll go in and we'll talk the matter over," she said. "And if there isn't Mrs. Peter coming up the lane this blessed minute," exclaimed Mrs. Spencer, bustling her guests through the hall into the parlor, where a deadly chill struck on them as if the air had been strained so long through dark green, closely drawn blinds that it had lost every particle of warmth it had ever possessed. "That is real lucky, for we can settle the matter straight away. Take the armchair, Miss Cuthbert. Anne, you sit here on the ottoman and don't wiggle. Let me take your hats. Flora Jane, go out and put the kettle on. Good afternoon, Mrs. Blewett. We were just saying how fortunate it was you happened along. Let me introduce you two ladies. Mrs. Blewett, Miss Cuthbert. Please excuse me for just a moment. I forgot to tell Flora Jane to take the buns out of the oven." Mrs. Spencer whisked away, after pulling up the blinds. Anne, sitting mutely on the ottoman, with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared at Mrs. Blewett as one fascinated. Was she to be given into the keeping of this sharp-faced, sharp-eyed woman? She felt a lump coming up in her throat, and her eyes smarted painfully. She was beginning to be afraid she couldn't keep back the tears when Mrs. Spencer returned, flushed and beaming, quite capable of taking any and every difficulty, physical, mental, or spiritual, into consideration and settling it out of hand. "It seems there's been a mistake about this little girl, Mrs. Blewett," she said. "I was under the impression that Mr. and Miss Cuthbert wanted a little girl to adopt. I was certainly told so. But it seems it was a boy they wanted. So if you're still of the same mind you were yesterday, I think she'll be just the thing for you." Mrs. Blewett darted her eyes over Anne from head to foot. "How old are you, and what's your name?" she demanded. "Anne Shirley," faltered the shrinking child, not daring to make any stipulations regarding the spelling thereof.
The author just sort of throws that in. Whoa, that was interesting. My screen just went black. The author just sort of throws in the idea that when Marilla asked Anne what her name was, Anne thought that Marilla would probably be understanding enough that she asked Marilla to call her Cordelia. In this case, not only does Anne say exactly what her name is, she doesn't even bother to tell Mrs. Blewett how important it is to spell her name with an E. So Anne realizes this woman is not going to be particularly understanding.
"And I'm 11 years old." "Humph! You don't look as if there was much to you, but you're wiry. I don't know but the wiry ones are the best after all. Well, if I take you, you'll have to be a good girl, you know. Good and smart and respectful. I'll expect you to earn your keep, and no mistake about that. Yes, I suppose I might as well take her off your hands, Miss Cuthbert. The baby's awful fractious, and I'm clean worn out attending to him. If you like, I can take her home right now." Marilla looked at Anne and softened at the sight of the child's pale face with its look of mute misery, the misery of a helpless little creature who finds itself once more caught in the trap from which it had escaped. Marilla felt an uncomfortable conviction that if she denied the appeal of that look, it would haunt her to her dying day. Moreover, she did not fancy Mrs. Blewett. To hand a sensitive, high-strung child over to such a woman— no, she could not take the responsibility of doing that. "Well, I don't know," she said slowly. "I didn't say that Matthew and I had absolutely decided that we wouldn't keep her. In fact, I may say that Matthew is disposed to keep her. I just came over to find out how the mistake had occurred. I think I'd better take her home again and talk it over with Matthew. I feel that I oughtn't decide on anything without consulting him. If we make up our mind not to keep her, we'll bring or send her over to you tomorrow night. If we don't, you may know that she is going to stay with us. Will that suit you, Mrs. Blewett?" "I suppose it will have to," said Mrs. Blewett, ungraciously. During Marilla's speech, a sunrise had been dawning on Anne's face. First the look of despair faded out, then came a faint flush of hope. Her eyes grew deep and bright as morning stars. The child was quite transfigured, and a moment later, when Mrs. Spencer and Mrs. Blewett went out in quest of a recipe the latter had come to borrow, she sprang up and flew across the room to Marilla. "Oh, Miss Cuthbert, did you really say that perhaps you would let me stay at Green Gables?" she said in a breathless whisper, as if speaking aloud might shatter the glorious possibility. "Did you really say it? Or did I only imagine that you did?" "I think you'd better learn to control that imagination of yours, Anne, if you can't distinguish between what is real and what isn't," said Marilla crossly. "Yes, you did hear me say just that and no more. It isn't decided yet, and perhaps we will conclude to let Mrs. Blewett take you after all. She certainly needs you more than I do." "I'd rather go back to the asylum than go to live with her," said Anne passionately. "She looks exactly like a gimlet." Marilla smothered a smile under the conviction that Anne must be reproved for such a speech. "A little girl like you should be ashamed of talking so about a lady and a stranger," she said severely. "Go back and sit down quietly and hold your tongue and behave as a good girl should." "I'll try to do and be anything you want me, if only you'll keep me," said Anne, returning meekly to her ottoman. When they arrived back at Green Gables that evening, Matthew met them in the lane. Marilla from afar had noted him prowling along it and guessed his motive. She was prepared for the relief she read in his face when he saw that she had at least brought Anne back with her. But she said nothing to him, relative to the affair, until they were both out in the yard behind the barn milking the cows. Then she briefly told him Anne's history and the result of the interview with Mrs. Spencer. "I wouldn't give a dog I liked to that Blewett woman," said Matthew with unusual vim. "I don't fancy her style myself," admitted Marilla. "But it's that or keeping her ourselves, Matthew. And since you seem to want her, I suppose I'm willing, or have to be. I've been thinking over the idea until I've got kind of used to it. It seems a sort of duty. I've never brought up a child, especially a girl, and I dare say I'll make a terrible mess of it, but I'll do my best. So as far as I'm concerned, Matthew, she may stay." Matthew's shy face was a glow of delight. "Well now, I reckoned you'd come to see it in that light, Marilla," he said. "She's such an interesting little thing." "It'd be more to the point if you could say she was a useful little thing," retorted Marilla. "But I'll make it my business to see she's trained to be that. And mind, Matthew, you're not to go interfering with my methods. Perhaps an old maid doesn't know much about bringing up a child, but I guess she knows more than an old bachelor. So you just leave me to manage her. When I fail it'll be time enough to put your oar in." There, Marilla, you can have your own way," said Matthew reassuringly. "Only be as good and kind to her as you can without spoiling her. I kind of think she's one of the sort you can do anything with if only you get her to love you." Marilla sniffed to express her contempt for Matthew's opinions concerning anything feminine, and walked off to the dairy with the pails. "I won't tell her tonight that she can stay," she reflected as she strained the milk into the creamers. "She'd be so excited that she wouldn't sleep a wink. Marilla Cuthbert, you're fairly in for it. Did you ever suppose you'd see the day when you'd be adopting an orphan girl? It's surprising enough, but not so surprising as that Matthew should be at the bottom of it, him that always seemed to have such a mortal dread of little girls. Anyhow, we've decided on the experiment, and goodness only knows what will become of it."
And that is the end of the chapter. We are going to summarize this yet right away. So chapter 6, the title of the chapter was Marilla Makes Up Her Mind. You want quotation marks at the beginning and the end because it is a chapter title. Capitalize Marilla, you would anyway because it's a name. Makes up her mind are all three important words. So you need to capitalize them. And only the first letter of those words, nothing else. The main characters in this chapter were Marilla and Anne. That's pretty obvious. You could say that Mrs. Spencer is a main character because that's whose house they go to, but the thing is, Mrs. Spencer doesn't really do anything in this chapter that's important, other than explaining how the mistake was made. Mrs. Blewett, however, totally changes the direction of this chapter, so we will include her as a main character. Remember, to summarize, we want to talk about the important action from the beginning of the chapter, the middle of the chapter, and the end of the chapter. So the important action really from the beginning all the way through the middle would be when Mrs. Blewett offers to take Anne. We could say that she offers to take Anne to make her work or watch the children, but that's enough. When Mrs. Blewett offers to take Anne, comma, it's a transition at the beginning, Rilla decides, so this is the middle of the sentence now, or the middle of the chapter, sorry. Mrs. Blewett offers to take Anne. Marilla decides to keep Anne. If we focus on the important action part, the very beginning of the chapter describing all the characters and so forth is not nearly as important as Mrs. Blewett offering to take Anne and then Marilla deciding to keep Anne. What's the important part about the end? Well, Marilla goes home. Yeah, that's not important. Makes Matthew promise not to interfere. What does it mean if you interfere with something? You mess it up. You make it so things don't happen the way they were intended to happen. So Marilla makes Matthew promise not to interfere with the way she, this is an old-fashioned way of saying it, brings up Anne. The way she teaches Anne, the way she tries to turn her and help her grow from being a child into an adult. We will color this line, but if yours is like mine, you are out of space. You should have been able to fit all of the summary for chapters 1 through 6 on this side of the page, writing neatly and small, making things fit. That is kind of an important skill, especially when you're needing to set things up from a distance. So this should all be on the first page. There is going to be an assignment in TeacherMade, so make sure that you go to that link. But for now, everything to do with Chapter 5, getting the information, is done. You can look back in this video to answer the questions in TeacherMade. If you are unsure of an answer, please look back in this video to find the answers for the 3 questions that you will need to do for today. That would be your homework assignment.